No matter how good a spline looks, you can only really tell if the shape is looking good if you extrude that spline and render the shape. So testing the spline shapes is an important part of my workflow to make sure that I get a nice looking shape. And in this case that's particularly important because we have to mirror this spline over to the top, and then we have to create a lot of copies. And I really don't want to find out at the very end, when all the pieces are finished, that something's wrong with those curves. The problem with our spline is that it is not a closed spline. We can extrude this spline by adding an extrude object, but you can see it is only extruded in the Z direction, which is not very helpful. So let's select the spline, and I'm going to hit Q. If you have the spline or the extrude object selected, you can use the Q key to toggle the extrude object on and off. So what I usually do with a spline like this is, first of all, I check Close Spline down here in the Attributes Manager. And that is not very helpful yet, because if I extrude it and render it, we can't really see the outline because we're getting a connection straight from the end point to the start point of the spline, and it cuts right through our spline shape. What we have to do is create an additional point on this line, and we can use the Move Scale or Rotate tools or the Pen tool to create an extra point here. And the way you do this is you hold down Control if you use the Move Scale or Rotate tools, and the cursor will change to an arrow with some dots. And now we can left click anywhere on this line to create a new point. The Pen tool works pretty much the same way. So if I select the Pen tool and hold down Control, the cursor will change to this horizontal line, and now I can left click anywhere on this line to create a new point. And now we can left click on the point and move it over somewhere to here. And now we have a shape that we can extrude. So if I switch on the extrude object and render this, we can now see the outline of our spline shape. If I get a little closer, you can see the spline looks quite faceted, and that is because of the settings for the spline resolution. If I select the spline, you can see down here the type is Bezier, and we have intermediate points that are set to adaptive. Adaptive means that Cinema 4D will create more points on curved sections on a spline to make those curved sections look round and smooth. And if you have a straight section, you don't get any intermediate points because 2 points are sufficient to define a straight line, so it doesn't make any sense to add any additional points in between the start point of a straight section and the end point of a straight section. So for a curved shape like this, adaptive is usually the setting that you want to use, because you're only getting points or more points in those areas where those points are actually needed. The resolution of the spline, or the detail or the smoothness of the curves, is defined by the angle of the spline. The default is 5 degrees, and if I increase this angle, our spline will look more faceted. In order to test your spline shape, it is sometimes helpful to add more resolution to the spline to make it look very smooth, so you can focus on the areas that may need tweaking without getting distracted by the fact that everything's looking a bit faceted. So in this case, I would decrease the angle all the way to 0 to get the maximum detail. And now we have something that is perfectly smooth. So let's see what we could tweak here. What I don't really like is the transition between this curve here and this curve up here. It could be a little smoother. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an extra point. I think this point here should be moved a little further down to here. But I don't want to move it manually because this will change the shape over here as well. what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to hold down Control and I'm going to create another point somewhere around here. Before I do though, I will make a copy of our spline. We can use this as a reference to tweak the new point we're going to create. So I'll hold down Control and maybe add a point here. And now we can select the original point and delete it. So you can see the shape stays intact here, and we're only changing the shape here. So now what we can do is select the point, select the pen tool again to bring up the options here, and I'm going to lock the tangent length, and I'm going to rotate the tangents here just a little bit. And then we can uncheck lock tangent length and check lock tangent rotation instead, and left click and drag on this tangent and drag it out until we get a transition into this line here. So let's see, so something like this, and this should give us a much better transition between this curve here and this curve here. If I render this, or maybe I should switch on the extrude first. So you can see we're getting a much nicer transition between these two curves now. So now the shape is looking exactly like we want it to look. And now we can select the point that we created earlier, delete this point, select the spline, and uncheck close spline. And we can delete the copy because we don't need that anymore. So now we can be sure that our spline shape is looking exactly like we want it to look. And now we can continue and finish this shape.